Here in the buttons and dials section, we're going to be taking a tour of the camera, looking at the remaining important controls on the outer side of the camera to see what they do and what we can discover. Let's start with the top deck of the camera. So the multifunction on the top of the camera is one that we're going to be using for a lot of different features. Now, traditionally, I've used this button to access the ISOs, which is something I would change quite frequently. So let me just show you real quickly on some of the operations that you want to be aware of on this button here. So by pressing the button, you'll bring up your options down along the bottom. You can press the button repeatedly to change where you're at. You can also turn the mode dial to change where you're at. Now, as I say, I usually use it in the ISO mode, which means I will press the button, I'll turn my ISO, set it, and then press down on the shutter release to just go back to shooting. So when I go back to the multifunction button, it's still in the ISO, and I can make that change. So if you're using one of these features a lot, you can very quickly get in there, make a change with it, and go back. Now, if you are a different type of photographer who is maybe changing your white balance, which we're going to be talking about here in a moment, you can leave it here, adjust your white balance, press the shutter release, and kick it back. Press the multifunction button, make your change, press the shutter release, and you go back out of it. And so it's always going to remain where you last left it. And so it's very easy to access one of these features and then go back and change it again very quickly. But it's also easy to get to one of those other 5 settings and make the appropriate adjustment very quickly once you get used to the certain dials and buttons that you need to press in order to do that. Now, so use the back dial or that mode dial for choosing which function, and then you always use that main dial on the top front of the camera for adjusting the particular feature that you're working with. Now, if you don't like the features that Canon has pre-programmed for this multifunction, you can go in and adjust that in Custom Function 3. So you can take out some of these modes and you can put in other ones. You can reprogram it to do exposure compensation, autofocus area, metering, or picture style. Now, unfortunately, that's the limit of the list. I kind of wish there was more things that we could add in there, but at least there's ones that we can swap out. And I can at least see one of those that I would like to swap out, and probably you do as well, depending on what type of photography you do. All right, so we've talked already about ISO, we've talked about the drive, we've talked about the focus mode. Let's talk about the next item on the list, which is white balance. So click over to white balance. We're going to have a bunch of different options. So the idea with white balance is to making sure that you're getting the right color for the environment that you're in. We have 3 different settings for natural environments. We've got 3 different settings for artificial environment. The one that's probably the most different is the tungsten light. This is a light that a lot of people have in their homes. If you're working under that and you have the camera set in, say, daylight, everybody's going to appear to have this orange tint to them, and everything's going to have like an orange filter over it. And so that's where you'd want to change it to tungsten. We do have a Kelvin temperature option, which is essentially a manual option. You can choose a specific number if you happen to know the color of lights you're working under, or you just want to set it someplace specifically that isn't already set by one of these other preset settings for you. We have a preset manual where you will photograph a white object, like a table, a wall, a piece of paper, and the camera will figure out what the color is and set the white balance according to that situation. And that can be very good when you're in a mixed lighting situation, maybe some window light and some fluorescent light, and it's not really any specific setting that you can figure out on your own. That's a way of letting the camera's technology help you figure out what the right one is. And I'll be doing a little demonstration of that when we get to shoot 3 in the menu, where we get to custom white balance. And then finally, there's auto white balance. And this is where a lot of us have left our cameras for a long time because, I think for 2 good reasons. Number one, it generally does a pretty good job most of the time. And for those of us who do shoot RAW, it's not a make or break issue, because if the camera was to not get it quite right, it's something that we can fix later on in post-production with no damage to the original image. If you do shoot in JPEG, it's a little more important that you get it set right. Now with the auto white balance, there's kind of a standard version of it and then a white priority version of it. And the standard version allows a little bit of an ambient natural light into the scene. And so if you were working in a tungsten lighting situation, yeah, it's going to let a little bit of that warm light in. If you are working in a scientific environment or a place where accurate colors are really important, let's say you're doing some work for a clothing manufacturer and they're going to be doing product photography, they want their fabrics accurately portrayed in color. And so that's where the white priority would probably be a big help in there. So one of those settings that you just kind of need to make sure that you have right, I think auto white balance is a good default position to leave the camera most of the time, and then you can adjust it on an as need be basis from there. All right, next up is flash exposure compensation. Now the camera does not have a built-in flash, so right now this function, no matter what you do to it, isn't going to have any effect on the photos that you take. But if you do add a flash to the camera, the primary way that most people work with an on-camera flash is with TTL photography, which is where the camera and the flash work together to figure out the correct exposure. And while the camera does a good job in the TTL mode, it is sometimes, well, technically it's correct, aesthetically it's a little bit too much power in some cases. And so it's quite common for photographers to power down their flash a little bit. 2/3 of a stop, 1 stop, as an example. Now it depends on what your subject is wearing, what the background is, the color of their hair, or what your subject is in any effect. And so you want to experiment a little bit with flash and powering down the flash to get a more natural look. It's a bit of a personal choice, aesthetic choice, but it is a common control that you would want to use when you are using flash. Now for those of you who don't use flash, this little portion of the multifunction options can be reprogrammed to do something else. And if you don't own a flash, you don't use a flash, I'd recommend it because there's a lot of other things that you might be able to put in there that you find more valuable. But for doing that particular feature, it's good to have that accessible. All right, the movie record button on the top of the camera, well, that will automatically kick you in to a recording mode and the movie mode of the camera. And that can be handy for any time you want to quickly jump over and start shooting movies. And so if you're somebody who's a hybrid shooter who shoots movies and stills and you quickly want to go back and forth, well, there's a button directly on the camera. You can jump straight there. We're going to talk more about movie shooting when we get to section 9 in the class. So that will be totally covered in that particular section. But for those of you who bought this stills camera to shoot stills and you do not care about shooting movies, this is a button that can be reprogrammed to do one of 45 different functions. And so you get to choose between 45 different options as to what that does. And so I'm going to be talking a lot more about customizing the camera later on in that custom function section of the class. And so get prepared for customizing the camera to your needs. All right, the lock button allows you to lock a number of controls on the camera so that they don't work anymore. This can be very handy in situations where you know you have something set in there and you don't want it to change. Let's say you're a sports photographer, you go into the arena, you set your shutter speeds, your apertures, and your ISOs. You don't want to bump the dials on the camera during the event because you've already got everything dialed in correctly. You could get all your controls set, hit the lock button, and then have the dials lock. Let's say you're somebody that has a love-hate relationship with the touch screen. You like using it for some things, but not other things. You can have it quickly turned on and off, essentially, the touch functions, by pressing the lock button and having the touch screen setting as the key item that you are locking. And so when you go into the multi-function lock feature of the menu, you get a checkbox among each of the items that you can turn on and off with this lock. And so it's just a great way to quickly lock down certain features for certain types of shooting situations. The LCD panel on the top of the camera will provide you with some basic exposure information as well as settings. And it has 2 different screens that you can swap between by pressing the light button. If you hold down on the light, it'll change it from light on dark to dark on light, which might be easier to see in certain types of lighting conditions. And so some nice key information in there. Now, if you don't use this LCD panel on the top of the camera, and I could very easily see how you can avoid using it because you do have the back panel on the camera, which can also show you pretty much everything that is in this little LCD panel. You can recustomize, reprogram the light button even to do something else. And so there's a whole bunch of different functions. You can have that light button turn on and off. And so if you don't use it, reprogram it. On the top of the camera, on the top left is a little symbol for the focal plane, and that indicates where the sensor is. So in case you need to measure from that to your subject, you will know what that distance is. It's highly unlikely that you'll need this, but there are certain types of, once again, scientific work, macro photography, where that might come in handy. Right next to that is the little speaker, and that is where your movie sound is being played back. So when you are playing back a little movie, not a big speaker, not great sound, but it's there if you need it. Over on the back side of the camera, we'll look at the menu button in more detail in sections 12 through 18. That's kind of the full list of all the features in the camera, and there is a lot to go through in that, so we've got several sections set aside for that. When you hit the playback button, the camera goes into a playback mode, and we're going to have different playback controls. And a lot of the buttons that did something in another mode now work a little bit differently. So we have a garbage can button, obviously for erasing images easily. The back dial is the easiest way to move from one image to the next. You can zoom in and out to check focus, and you can do that with the magnification button, and then you can dial it with the mode dial, getting it set exactly where you want it to be. You can also turn the front dial to jump 10 images. Now this is something that you can alternate to something else if you want. If you want to jump to star-rated images or from movie to movie mode, you can do that by going into Playback 4 and choosing what that front dial is used for changing. Over on the left side is a rate button, and this is where you can rate images. You can also record audio sound if you want. So if you played back an image and you want to record some information about it, if you're traveling and you're going to send somebody a photo, you could have them read their email address so that you have access to it. During a sporting event, you could do a little voice memo about this was the catch that was important for this reason, because that might be hard to figure out in just the photos. And so it's a great way to just add a little bit of information. Now, if you want to play things back, you'll have to go back into the playback menu and then reprogram the camera slightly in order to do that. You can also use the touch screen in the playback mode for going through images and seeing how it's another little item we should talk about. Let's go ahead and take a look on the back of the camera. So if we're live now, when we go back and play a recent image, we can use common controls for swiping back and forth on an image. You can double tap to zoom in and use your common kind of move around and then pinch to zoom out. You can go out to thumbnails and you can go through different images like so. Double tap on it, double tap to zoom in. If you don't want to use the screen for doing that, you can still use the joystick and the zooming in and out button if you want. So I don't know, I think touchscreen is loved by some people and other people just don't care about it. It's a way to divide people up. Are you a touchscreen lover or not? All right, here's a cool little secret tip. If you want to adjust the screen brightness, you can press and hold that light button for 2 seconds and it'll give you the option of brightening up the screen. Sometimes when you're out photographing under bright sunlight, it's either hard for you or people that you're sharing photos with to see the screen on the camera. So if we play back an image now, all right, here's our playback image. We hold down on the light button right here by the LCD on the top of the camera for a couple of seconds. We can then darken and lighten our image accordingly. And we don't have to dive into the menu to do it. We just come up to the light, hold it down for 2 seconds. It's a light, it's a brightness thing, so it's kind of easy to remember. Normally, leave it in the middle. That way you're judging your exposures correctly. If you're working at nighttime, you might want to dial this down so it doesn't destroy your night vision if you're doing astrophotography, for instance. But it's a very easy and quick secret function. Reminds me of Fuji cameras. Fuji cameras have a lot of these secret functions. They're unlabeled and unspecified. and you just don't find them on other cameras. So I don't know if Canon is getting into the secret functions thing, but you got to dive pretty deep in the instruction manual to find that little one. All right, so playback controls. If you hit the info button, it's going to cycle through different bits of information. Just simply hit the info button again to get to the next screen, and it cycles through again. You can also get additional information by scrolling through. And so there's a whole bunch of information that you can scroll through with histogram. You can see shooting data about what lens you used, what image parameters you've set. And so there's some information that you may or may not find useful. This is something that you can customize later on in the playback menu. Let me go ahead and just show you some of this in person. So let's go ahead and play back an image. We hit info once for a bit more information. And again, we have a lot of information. And this is where we're going to use our little joystick to cycle through. We can see, what focal length we're at, if we've had white balance set a certain way, our picture controls, clarity and other settings in the camera. If you don't find this useful, as I said, we're going to be able to have a checkbox to untick any one of these screens that we are not interested in seeing. And so we will really be able to customize the camera exactly the way you want it. You can also access the quick menu when you're in the playback mode, and it will be different items than you would normally have in the quick menu. We're going to be going through all these items when we go through the playback menu, but this is a shortcut to some of those features. And so if you are wanting to play an image back and adjust it or work with it in some way, some of those controls are available right here. Now, if you have shot a video and you play back that, you're going to have a separate set of controls. You'll have volume up with your front top dial, main dial on the camera. Then there's a whole host of playback options you'll get to by pressing the set button. And I'm going to do a few demonstrations and show you a little bit more about this when we do the movie shooting section, because that's where we have everything movie related. The AF on button, something we talked about back in the autofocus section. And this is also one of those buttons that you get to customize. So if you don't like back button focus, or you don't use this button for it, you want to reprogram it, customize the button. Same thing can be said for AEL. Talked about this back in the exposure section, but it's one of the many buttons that can be customized into many different options. The AF point selection can be customized. I don't recommend it too highly because it's labeled and it's the type of thing that a lot of photographers do adjust on a regular basis. So I think that one's in a pretty good spot. But if you want to, it is available for reprogramming. The magnify button will allow you to zoom in on a live view subject so that you can manually focus or check focus and make sure that you've got it exactly the way you want it. You can also use the touch screen when you're in that mode as well. By just hitting the info button when you're in the normal shooting mode, you can cycle through different screens that have different sets of information. And so sometimes you just want to see the image. Sometimes the quick control is handy when you are shooting mostly through the viewfinder and you want to keep control or keep an eye on your settings on the back of the camera, because it's a nice, big, easy to see control. Sometimes it's nice to have the histogram available right when you're shooting, or the horizon level in there can be very handy. One of the options is off, and that is not naturally turned on. And so you need to go into Shooting Info Display Options under Shoot menu number 7, and you can check the box for it off if you want to be able to just turn it off to conserve battery power. This quick control screen is nice to have because it does show you the images left on your card as well as your battery life. And so those are two things that you kind of want to keep an eye on to make sure that you're not getting low on either one. The quick menu, well, we're going to have a whole section on that, but that gets you into a shortcut of some main key controls that you'll want to have access to on a regular basis. There's an access lamp that basically tells you that your camera is working and it's probably downloading images to the memory card. A diopter right by the viewfinder is for adjusting the focus of the viewfinder itself. Over on the left side, we mentioned early on in the class about the autofocus manual focus switch. Most people are going to leave this in autofocus, but there's times where manual focus is a very good option. Many lenses, not all though, have a stabilizer, and they'll have a switch here. Now the camera does have a stabilizer built into the camera itself, and this is the master control for it. It's going to be on the lens. Now for lenses that do not have a stabilizer built into it, then there'll be a mode in the camera, and you'll see that when we go through the menu system. On the bottom side, not much down here, we have our serial numbers to record for insurance purposes. On the front side, we've talked a bit about the shutter release. Lens release, we'll talk a little bit more about in the camera connections. Our depth of field preview button. All right, so we've got a nice big depth of field preview button. This is a traditional feature on top of the line cameras, but it's made its way onto lower end cameras in the more modern era. And the idea with this is that you press the button down and it stops the aperture down to its working aperture so that you can see right through the viewfinder or on the back screen of the camera how much depth of field you're going to get with that particular feature. Now, traditionally this was helpful because you wouldn't know about this until you had your film developed. And then with digital cameras, you could always take a look at the back of the camera, but the problem is that you couldn't always see the back screen of the camera in bright sunlight. Now you should be able to see what you're going to get if you just take a photo. So you could just take a photo. This button is not really necessary in the modern era, so long as you're willing to take a photo. If you don't want to do that, you can always just see the preview of it here. The reason I'm telling you this is that if you're willing to review an image to watch it, you can reprogram this button to do something else. So always be aware of the reprogramming option on a lot of these buttons. All right, I don't know what happened here. This is really weird. Pretty much every camera I've done a class on for the last several years has had stereo microphones. And this is the first camera to have mono microphone. And I guess they've just kind of given up and said, you know what, if you're going to record audio, you're probably going to hook up a better microphone. It has much better quality. And you know, it's going to be fine for real simple basic video. But if you do want to get better quality audio, you definitely are going to want to hook up a mic on this camera. We have a self-timer assist beam, and this will turn on when you have the self-timer turned on to let you know when the shutter is going to fire. It is also an AF assist beam, which actually becomes a very low-powered and slightly annoying flashlight that will turn on. And while it technically works within short distances, it can be very irritating to subjects that you're pointing it at, or if you're working around other photographers all photographing the same subject, now you have a light on that subject that the other people are photographing, and chances are they're not going to be happy that you're doing that. There is a remote control sensor. You can hook up the RC6 to trigger the camera. So if you don't want to touch the camera, you want to get in the shot yourself, inexpensive way of doing it. Our shutter unit here automatically closes so that you do not see or have access to the sensor, or most importantly, dust will be prevented from getting to the sensor. And so this is a great system that I hope other mirrorless cameras and brands will figure out. It's a good way to protect the sensor from the camera, but it does close in there. But also, it is a very delicate device, and so you do not want to be poking your finger or anything else in there at that shutter unit. Do not touch it. Do not stick anything in there. You want to be careful with that, because if that breaks, it is a hefty repair cost. This is about as close as we get to the sensor, so we'll talk for a moment about that. 45 megapixels, full frame. It's great. Yeah, it does a good job. Okay, that was your tour of the camera, looking for all the remaining buttons and dials. Hopefully you've discovered a few useful tools on there, as well as a few buttons that you can kind of plan to reprogram and customize when we get to that customization menu in the class.